that will fall into the American Indians, because we know that the American Indians, such as laws like the 1740 Act passed after the Stono Rebellion in 1739, the Stono Indians in South Carolina, which later they made it into an African story, but actually there's a nation called the Stono Indians who battled for that port of Charleston since before the arrival of the Goose Creek men. They actually battled for that territory, the Stono Indians. Yeah, the Stono River there, and that rebellion was actually them. If we go into the original document of the 1740, I think it was Article 4, 2 or 4, it speaks about the law was passed because of the Indians, the Stono Rebellion. But
well, Chief, can I add on to that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because that law was passed. It's called the 1740 Act, but that was the last part of it that started in the 1660s in Barbados, which was referred to as the Act for the Better Ordering of Slaves. Now, in this document, they mention American Indians. In fact, they say Indians, and they do not mention Africans at all or their terminology. And there was a series of acts with that. It was a Bayesian planter who had gone to South Carolina or to the Carolinas area at that time and was discussing what to do with the population of people there, specifically the hostiles or the American Indians. But what we see, we can really say the 1500s in La Florida, when the Spanish missionaries were dealing with the Calusa Empire, the Mocama chiefdom, the Timacuas, and those missionaries couldn't get a footing of their settlement. And so what they did was send a lot of those Indians down to Cuba because it's a straight shot there. They sent them to the Caribbean as well. But when you get into the 1600s, and you mentioned this earlier, you have a very long list. From 1611, you can go to the Powhatan's War when Ope-Chacano and the Virginia merchants were like, no, we have to get rid of these Indians, and they sent them where? To Barbados. Then you have the 1630s, the Pequot Wars, where they sent them in the Narragansett down to Barbados. There were a lot of acts and legislation during that time that are in the books of Massachusetts that speak about that. And if you can pull up one of the slides, they have that. Metacon wrote a speech in 1675 about he not wanting to go to, or any of his people being sent to Barbados anymore. They were scattered throughout the Caribbean. So those 20 and odd Negroes, what ethnicity would be?
In your terms, Professor?
To go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, I've yet to find a case anywhere of a European enslaved to the extent that the offspring of that European was also enslaved.
I agree with that.
Well, I have a question about that. Honestly, what was the 1709 Act in Boston where they wanted to bring in quote-unquote white servants? And there was some legislation and talk about that.
Right.
Well, the reason why I say that is because the Bacon's Rebellion, is that where you're going with it, Professor? The Bacon Rebellion would end that indentured servitude and European with Bacon?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there were indigenous people shipped to the Caribbean, especially in the first century and a half after European contact, and they were certainly enslaved, but haven't found any evidence of this that individuals from Europe were ever in a situation where their servitude was permanent and the offspring of their were also enslaved. And that's what makes African slavery different.
Can I ask a question on that as well?
Sure.
I understand the difference as far as the indentured servants and them having a difference between the ones that are enslaved. But if we go back to the methodology of your actual slave voyages, would you be able to tell the difference of just the voyage in itself to know what ships are carrying indentured servants based on? I know we can tell later as far as the extent of their servitude and the condition by the mother, but when you're just starting off with the voyage coming over, how can you tell whether this is a group of servants being brought over or slaves?
Good question.
Well, this I don't know if you know the work of David Galenson, who did a couple of books on this topic, but there is no doubt that there are a large number of voyages coming from the UK and Ireland especially, but in no instance do we have clear indication that the people on board were permanently enslaved. This is a status which, in my research, is reserved entirely for Africans.
That wasn't a belief system or a legal practice for the English. And in fact, they wrote it in the law. Dulcie, would you mind pulling up the commentaries on the laws of England? So this is one of the, I guess one of the questions I had as well, because what I would say is if today, if I look back at someone's writings from whatever time period, and they write what they see, they write what they experience, and then if I come 300 years later and say, well, that person could not have meant that. If I were to read my own writing, I wouldn't know what to take from that, because number one, it's a primary source. So right here, this is the chapter in the book where they're talking about master and servant. And they're basically describing the four relationships that exist. So the first one is literally the master and the servant. The second is the husband and the wife.
Right.
The third is the parent and the child. And the fourth is the guardian and the ward. Now, if you go to the next page, if you look at the very first sentence of the page, it says, as to the several sorts of servant, I have formerly observed that the pure and proper slavery does not, nay, cannot subsist in England. Such I mean, whereby an absolute and unlimited power is given to the master over the life and fortune of the slave. Indeed, it is repugnant to reason and the principles of natural law that such a state should subsist anywhere. So this is the belief. Now this guy, William Blackstone, he grew up an orphan. Both his parents died. They were a part of those religious persecutions or whatnot. He graduated from Oxford at like 12 or 16 years old. He never set foot in a courtroom in his life. He just studied it, he taught it, he learned from others. And this book right here is quoted as the most important legal book on English law. So I guess my question would be, when we're defining what a slave is, there's a definition and an understanding that they had back then, but then we have an understanding of today. And if you look down at the bottom, where the red line is at the bottom, it says, but secondly, it is said that slavery may begin jure civile, when one man sells himself to another, this only if meant of contracts to serve or work for another is very just. But when applied to strict slavery in the sense of the laws of old Roman or modern Barbary, is also impossible. So if you go back earlier in the book as well, they talked about how, and this is a very long book, it's like 1,500 pages. It took me a while to get through it all, from the people that were before them. And the decision that they made was, we're not going to perform absolute almighty slavery, because when someone does not have control over their life, they're more prone to rebel. And that was the reason why they made that decision to not have outright slavery. So the way I see it today, and this is just my personal perspective, everyone has their own perspective on the panel, but when I see someone who publishes this book and then fast forward to March 22nd, 1775, Edmund Burke gave a speech to a parliamentary in Europe. It says, I have been told by an eminent bookseller that in no branch of his business have the tracts of popular devotion were so many books as those of the law exported to the plantations. The colonists have now fallen into the way of printing them for their own use. I hear that they have sold nearly as many books of Blackstone commentaries in America as in England. Now, if you think about how big England was at that time, they had quite a few countries underneath their wing, and there were clearly more people in England than there was over here, but they sold just as many books. And one of the reasons why is because the people over, the colonists over here, didn't understand the law. And once they read this particular book, you start to see more petitions submitted. So for example, the same year, the 1765 Stamp Act came out. Because of this book, they were able to file a proper rejection, and that's when they rejected the Stamp Act, because they didn't want to pay all of those taxes, which hence the phrase taxation without representation comes from. Mm-hmm. So you start to see a lot of, we'll call it structure, come within the colony. This is the one that was published by Chancellor Kent, where they adopted literally the same exact model that William Blackstone laid out in his commentaries, where these are the 3 ways you can become a slave. They adopted the same model coming up into the antebellum years. Let's say, for example, if you were a husband and you have a wife, you have a contract. Your wife is your servant. Your wife is your slave. Mm-hmm. Not in the sense of how we look at it today, but from a standpoint of a legal position, your wife, your kids, they were your slaves. So yeah, here's Chancellor Kent's commentaries. So he wrote this book in like 1832. But he did an interview with a guy who was a military official. His name was Asa King. So they kind of broke the book down in a Q&A perspective, if you will. And the second question says, how, according to the Institutes of Justinian, might a person become a slave? In 3 ways. By birth of your mother, who was a slave. How do you become a slave? Through indentured servitude. Number 2, captivity or war. And number 3, by the voluntary sale.
Okay, but I don't see anything in that which contradicts what I just, what I said before.
Well, if you sell yourself, you have to sign the contract.
Well, yes. So you're giving up your life's labor,
right?
But that's not the same thing as chattel slavery. Chattel slavery means that not only you but your descendants are also slaves. And I, as I said a few minutes ago, I don't find any case at all in any part of the Americas where a European not only became subject to lifetime servitude, but also had the basic problem that any subsequent offspring would also be in the same status. That,
well, see,
that's what chattel slavery means to me.
Okay, so I agree with you on that, Dave. So the people who are the chattel slavery is upon, in my search, in my research, will be the indigenous people of America.
Yeah, that's for sure. 4
million people that are speaking about during the time of the Civil War, 1866, the 14th Amendment, which Trump is using right now as his primary. He's using the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship. 4 million people, as he said, it was to women and children of slaves. So I don't think that would include the European, because in my family, slave schedules, my grandfather, his family came from Switzerland back in the 1700s, but he married a Cherokee Indian. Now, the Cherokee Indian is his wife, but she is listed as his slave, and their son is listed as the slave as well. But he being of European stock, he's not. So that takes me also in the writing, in that legislation, it was written that it was for Indians not taxed, or Indians who basically left their tribe and became U.S. citizens. Right. So, and it also made sure that it said that the aliens were not included, the illegals, which would be considered the African in the situation, because in America, not until 1870, the Africans get ability to even own land or anything like this. So this would have to be talking about the indigenous people of America.
Right.
What do you say to that?
Yeah. So I agree.
Yes, sir.